going around.
Jet propelled.
Yep.
Mike Brigida was the lead clinician, in my opinion, for ARP. An incredibly talented guy. I mean, it's just up at his home. We're fast friends. We both work at Berklee College of Music presently. And Mike's the kind of guy, if somebody says, oh, you want to sing such and such a tune? Okay, what key? Not only does he know the tune, he can play it in any key. And I don't mean just, Lutheran hymn, homophonic hymn, Lutheran hymn, four square. I'm talking fully embellished with all kinds of ideas and, amazing talent and other talents. But we've talked about this, that we were both jet propelled for 10, 15 years out in the field, shilling our merchandise, training people, doing all kinds of stuff. A typical industry week was 80 hours. People try to tote that up and say, oh, it couldn't have been. What are you talking about? 80 hours is only 6 days at 14 hours a day. I went many days longer than 14 hours, up in the morning, there in the store, training the sales group there, or lunch with, stand on the floor, sell stuff, go out with a dealer that evening, come back to a public event where you were, doing the clinician thing that night, still to the dealer, and midnight, so forth. 14, 20 hours easily, and day after day of that kind of stuff. Anyhow, Mike and I both had that experience and did those things, being jet propelled, before. I think it was interesting. We knew each other. We weren't exactly chums as competitors, but we had respect for each other and so forth. And there was no, terrible negativity. One day, quite by accident, I guess, or karma, we were seated exactly next to each other just by chance on an airplane going somewhere, probably to a trade show. And, we're talking shop and everything. And I told him, I said, well, when are you going to stop doing this, Mike? He said, what do you mean stop? Why should I stop? I said, you don't think we could keep burning the candle at both ends and the middle like this forever, do you? He'd never thought about it. And he admits this now. He says, oh, yeah, you changed my life. I said, yeah, maybe, I don't know, for whatever reason. But shortly thereafter, he started working for Ray Kurzweil, doing some of the same things. When the Moog company went under, I got out of the business. I did not want to go to work for Japan Incorporated. I don't think that's a racist statement. I think my assessment was fairly accurate, that many Japanese companies would rather arrive at the wrong conclusion if it's done collegially than the right conclusion if it's done by one brilliant person. I was even told at Yamaha when I interviewed out there one time, and I must have projected the self-confidence that I usually do. Well, Tom, at Yamaha, we don't have any superstars. And I thought to myself, yeah, that's why your products usually suck when you bring them to NAMM. The DX7 certainly was a stirring success, but a lot of people don't remember that Yamaha brought all kinds of stuff to trade shows before that sucked. I mean, they didn't fit the market. They were 200 pounds. They were this, they were that. That the presets in them sucked, just. So that's when I got into education, kind of by the skin of my teeth, past 40, PhD in hand, but never having taught in ivy-covered walls. And I was happy to find a place like Berklee, which is a halfway house. It's sort of halfway between academia and industry. But 80-hour work weeks that was nothing. People don't realize how intense that entire experience was. And we finally both decided, that's right, we can't keep doing this. It's fun. And even that, it's an ego shot. You go places and people hang on every word you say because you're from the factory and they want to find out stuff and so forth and so on. Even that after a while, it's like, yeah, okay, so who cares, I just told somebody in Des Moines how a mini Moog works. So why should I tell somebody in Dubuque? You get to that point. or you get allergic to the word. So he and I both, I think, got to that point. And he's been teaching 20, coming up 22 and me 21 at Berkeley, which we both enjoyed, but maybe even that is too much, of one thing. So. Yeah, it's giving you your cue.
Oops. Yeah, that's okay. Said I'm not in center screen. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So tell me.
And you'll probably want to record a little bit of ambient air. Do you do that? I mean, you'll have some in between talking. There's enough there,
I think, but it wouldn't do any harm. Wouldn't. Yeah. Okay. Damn, I should have had a haircut. Okay, tell me about Roger Luther.
Yes, Roger Luther. When I was first at the Moog Company, 72, something like that, the resident. Now I lived in East Aurora, New York, and was working there. Or thereabouts. I get a little confused. Roger showed up to the Moog plant with his wife, who may at that time have been pregnant, and said, I want to work here. And, there was no job posting. There was no job. I mean, but I think Bob Moog must have, in essence, prevailed upon Waytana. This was in Williamsville, I'm pretty sure. By this time, Waytana had purchased the company and brought it to Buffalo, Williamsville, New York. Anyhow, it's one of those American Horatio Alger stories. He shows up, he's willing to sweep the floors just so he can work where Bob Moog is and the Moog Company and so forth. And as time goes on, he becomes a tech. He's a very bright guy. He's very interested in modules and how they're made. He wound up building this incredible modular system while he was there at the plant. Beautiful people, he and his wife. And certainly by the time I was thinking about modules in those early days, he had already done some stuff that influenced me. He had several little portable things with jacks on them. I felt that some of the deficiencies of the Moog modules were they didn't have enough attenuators, not enough attenuators on the control inputs, to which Bob would say, well, you've got these 4-channel mixers. I said, yeah, but you're using up a 4-channel mixer when you just need one attenuator, for Pete's sakes. There were a couple of other things like that. And Roger had developed Move a Totovolt, Move a Mult, and Port-a-Pot, such that they were just like a jack, a male plug that would go in someplace, and then soldered onto that an attenuator, and then a female, for out. So you just put this Port-a-Pot right there, and then you'd stick your cable into that, and you'd have this pot on the side to act as an attenuator, not use up a mixer. And then Totovolt, of course, was a bias, same idea. You didn't have to use any of the few attenuators in the system, and then Move a Mult, which would a multiple, of stick one in and get several out, and then you had those little widgets that Roger had done, and he and I were totally in accord about what we felt could improve modules. I mean, Bob hadn't changed them since they'd been built, way back from 65, 66, when he started taking them to AES shows and stuff like that, trade shows. And then I instigated the development of several modules along those lines, basically. I never thought of it as proprietary on my part. It was just, yeah, that's right. I agree, Roger. Yeah, we need more attenuators. And we had one that had 4 attenuators, and you could jack into the top or the bottom, I don't remember. And it was normal such that you could have 3 different versions of that voltage coming out of the other, or you could do it 2 and 2. In other words, or you could do it 1, 2, 3, 4 separate attenuators. Kind of an interesting little module. And a couple of other things like that. And then we put out a Moog 20, I think it was called. There was the 12, which Vancouver had used at the Taco Bell restaurants, the 15, which was in one Tolex case, each of these, and basically what became a mini Moog, a voice, several oscillators, a filter, an amp, envelope generators, a couple of envelope generators, and so forth, and some of these mixers. So when we took away a couple of the mixers or something, we were able to put a few other modules in because we had this attenuator panel, and that there weren't that many changes and that many new modules, and I don't think there was ever any intention. I proved that it was viable to keep building them, when I came and doubled the sales and so forth. And there was a man named Pat Petronsky that was sort of shepherding all of that back in the tech thing. And Pat, occasionally there'd be a few ideas, but there weren't anything like what Serge or Don Buchla or people like that were continuing to proliferate modules. But it didn't fit Norlin, which owned Moog at that juncture, or either Bill Waitana, who was trying to sell it to Norlin, their distribution scheme, which was basically music dealers throughout the world. Interesting thing, too, about that. When Norlin bought Moog, the first marketing manager was Timothy O. White, who eventually went to Booth Newspapers. All of the marketing managers came from non-music backgrounds. Fisher-Price Toys, Quaker Oats, French's Mustard, Gabriel Shock Absorbers, et cetera, et cetera. And I kept preaching, well, the trouble is your marketing guys, they know a lot about marketing, but they don't know the field they're in. And this is a tiny little field. It's a mom and pop field. Now, again, another story even about that. But I remember when Norlin took over, I was tapped to, okay, he's going to survive the transition. And I heard right away, oh, well, you guys have only got 3 reps in the field. And so, we have 44 salesmen. We're just going to kill with Moog synthesizers. And I said, no, you're not. People just don't want to hear what's not part of the party line. And it's just endemic to human beings. And Tim didn't want to hear it. And, I got then from the VP of Norlin, I get such a dose of negative when I talked to Tom Ray. And I went to him and said, hey, look, Chuck, you wouldn't get a dose of negative if you guys ever did anything right. I would carry you around on my shoulders, thereby, further endearing myself to them. But my ace in the hole was always, well, look, the guy sells about $7 million worth of stuff every year. What are you going to do? One Enlighten manager came in, and I was getting some static from a bean counter type, and he went and read the bean counter out. Says, what are you doing to my guy? He sells stuff. Leave him alone. That kind of stuff. But as it turns out, and I said it, again, the crystal ball, I said, no. I said, look, you got push, but you don't have pull. You can push them into the dealers. You can twist their arms because you got Gibson guitars. They want Gibson guitars. You can make them buy Moog. Okay? But you got no pull. You got no way to get the dealer to get them out. I think Vancouver had left by then. It's a little bit, it's very checkered on and off, he and I both, because of who owned the company and, what they were promised, what we were promised, and so forth. All that back and forth. But as it turns out, it happened exactly as I said. Yeah, I said, you'll fill up the dealers, and therefore for 4 to 6 months, it'll look really good. The trend will look wonderful. You'll pound Moog synthesizers into every little nook and cranny in the whole country, maybe places in the world. I said, then the bottom will drop out, and it'll be like a cliff. You're not going to make them buy stuff they can't sell. In the final analysis, no matter how much they want Gibson, they're just going to tell you, okay, then I'm not going to buy any Gibson from you, and you sell it someplace. I've got a record of selling that. So, yeah, it happened just that way. Why? Well, they could make the dealers buy them, but they couldn't ensure that they'd get sold. So they kept looking at it as, it's a distribution problem. And now that we've got this distribution, everything's going to be rosy. And I said, no. You know, and again, do people want you to rain on their marketing parade? They do not. You know, so this guy actually fired me at a point, and I wrote a long memo. He kept another guy, I won't mention his name, but I had hired the other guy. So I wrote a longish memo pointing out this is what I've done. It's what the other guy's done. And I'm coming over there Monday at your expense. Don't come. We won't talk to you. I said, yes, you will. I flew from Buffalo to Chicago, came in Monday morning. We'll see Tim. You won't see. I said, well, I'll sit here all day. Worse than that, I'll handcuff myself to something. I'll call the police. So finally he comes out and says, I told you we wouldn't talk. I said, I told you we would. We talked from 10 o'clock that morning till 2 a.m. the next morning. I had my job back. But that's the kind of problems, for instance, that the company had. Now, one of the things I'll tell you about Bob Moog, people say, well, Bob wasn't a good businessman. Bob had a third eye for people. When he was a garage shop and needing representation in the bi-coastal situation in New York and L.A., he chose precisely the right people to do that. Walter Sear on the East Coast and Paul Beaver on the West Coast, because of their connections, and just he knew and had a feel for people, and he found these people somehow, and it flourished because of that. So a lot of people look at business as, bottom line, numerical. This is how business works. Business works in many ways at different levels, of garage shop to entrepreneur to a multinational, multi-million-dollar corporation. Bob ran his business at the level it started and flourished pretty well. If one thing he erred on the side of spending too much of his time and company resources trying to do one of kinds of things for famous musicians who wanted certain things and stuff like that, paying a lot of attention to the field. And as Les Truby, the partner of Vancouvering, told me, another one of my mentors, Les, he says, many times we make the sale, but somebody else takes the order for home organs. And I understand that exquisitely. Many times Bob Moog made the sale, but another company got to take the order, because Bob had blazed the trails and pioneered and, done the things that needed to be done. He hired this woman in New York for $25,000 a year to do publicity, in which most people must have thought he was insane, but the Moog synthesizer became almost generic.
Would it have done that without her, though?
I don't think, not as quickly. It's like everything. One of the problems with marketing, and Vancouvering pointed this out to me, he says, you can't win. If you go to Europe, which he did, and, vastly expand the dealership network and sell a whole potload of instruments and stuff like this, then he could have Bill Waitana publicly excoriating him at a dinner because, he hadn't done this before. So if you succeed, well, how come we didn't have this before this time? If you fail, well, obviously that, you get a $200 million parachute. It's the guy with Merrill Lynch, who blew $8 billion. But no, it is a no-win proposition, marketing in general, because nobody knows exactly the shape of that future. And if they fare well, it's what you should have done. If you don't do well, you're fired, kind of a thing. So interesting, there were 8 or 9 different regimes that I worked for at Norland. All these MBAs, Master's Business Administration, from prestigious colleges, Yale, Sloan, Harvard, all those places. And yet none of them could function much better than the people that began the thing. So what does it tell you? Well, it tells you that when you make assessments about business, you need a broader context of how you're placing the people, a realization that all of the American companies went bankrupt or changed hands under unfavorable circumstances. Sequential Circuits, Oberheim, ARP, right down the line. And that the new generation of people that started building instruments were well-heeled, huge corporations that could come to NAMM and have a dog. Didn't matter. They're building sailboats too and motorcycles. Who cares? You know? So I don't think the people at the garage shop up, which I was certainly a part of the up, maybe didn't understand that, you could say, well, we should have, but okay. There's a natural business cycle. And then when you learn about that, you look back and you see what happened and you realize it was in the cards. None of those garage shop style companies was going to survive. And indeed, none of them did. I mean, there may be some of them out there that are using that name still, but it's not the same financial circumstance that's undergirding it. So, people have all kinds of opinions about things, but they haven't really looked at the situation closely. And they also don't have historical perspective. Oh, I've seen this cycle before. You saw it with Dumont in television. He's a brilliant man, but he wasn't going to beat RCA. I mean, this is just, it's endemic to our capitalistic system that these things happen the way they do.
Mm.
I like to give people credit that, that are not heard from in Taco and what's his name?
Mm.
I think their view was too small. And I understand why. You delimit a book. I'm just talking. I understand the difference. But as soon as I realized, well, these guys I'm not going to be a part of their book, and I understand why. You see, I guess what I'm really doing is looking for an honest man over and over and over. An honest man, you'd be able to tell him, your shit stinks. And he would say, I think that's right. So what? Again, you get a lot of things because you don't give a shit whether you want them or not in some ways. I've seen this happen in my life over and over. It's like if you lust after something a little too hard, often you foul up your own ability to reach out and get that thing. So I'm like Muhammad a little bit. I got to float like a bee, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee.
Tell me about Eric Sidé. Did you have
Eric Sidé?
Yeah.
What a gentleman! What a wonderful gentleman. British, I think.
Maybe.
Yeah, Eric Sidé. He was one of the people that Bob Moog put me onto when I was doing my dissertation research. And there I was in New York, not knowing anybody, a real bumpkin from the country. And he was so kind to me. Eric, went in, talked, interviewed him, and, he played all this stuff for me. He had this Martineau there, this on his Martineau. And he had done the old ABC logo, with the shake on it, which you don't hear now, of course, but I'd heard it. And he'd done that on Martineau. And he'd done the old Maxwell House coffee ad. That one, on using a piece of Moog equipment that Bob had one of for Eric Sidé. I referred to Bob, if he erred, possibly it was loving musicians too much, and taking care of them too much from a business standpoint. But that did build the marketplace. Therefore, the comment about Bob made a lot of sales for which he didn't get to take the order. Eric, fine musician, a real gentleman. I believe his wife was named Edith. Wonderful lady. They fed me. They were just salt of the earth. And Eric told me about Raymond Scott, what Bob had told me, and he told me, oh, Raymond is touched with genius, no question. He knew Raymond Scott, and Raymond, I think, was touched with genius. More than touched, 200 ASCAP tunes, and on and on and on. The fabulous musician, popular in his day, did Lucky Strike Hit Parade, both on radio and on television. A fabulous, again, these are to me all fabulous characters. Eric Sidé, Wendy Carlos, Oscar Sala, whom I met in Berlin behind the Iron Curtain, and I couldn't speak German, he couldn't speak English. Somehow we still communicated. You know, fabulous characters in the field of electronic musical instruments and electroacoustic music.
So did you go to see Oscar Sala when you were doing your PhD?
No, I couldn't afford that. I mean, I could barely afford a trip to New York. That was about it. And I was getting all this free information from interlibrary loan at Vanderbilt, thanks to Lois Christ and Miss Birdsong, which I never knew Miss Birdsong's first name. I mean, I couldn't have done my dissertation without those two women. I couldn't afford it. And the idea that I could get a grant, I tried that in subsequent years, but always I would get, what university, where do you teach? And of course I was in business. I wasn't, I don't, well, what do you do? And one of them actually told me candidly, we've never dealt with an individual before. And I pretty much said, yeah, I think that's going to be the case over all the years. So while I was early in recognizing the importance of preserving the history of electronic musical instruments, I wouldn't say I've had that much success personally. I wrote my dissertation. We started the Electronic Arts Foundation. David Van Koevering, Les Truby, me, 3 people. We collected instruments. I'm a shoestring. And for some reason, we never incorporated to be a nonprofit, and I don't know why. I mean, some of the things happened the way they did. Les died of cancer. David was having financial problems and so forth. I was struggling, to make ends meet as somebody in the music business and so forth. But we had a large collection of instruments that burned at David Van Koevering's home in Cleveland, Tennessee. And we had put on several shows. We did one at NAMM, trade show in Chicago, and we did one at Herb Deutsch's college, Hofstra, outside of New York there, that got some press.
What sort of instruments did you have in the collection?
We had a Telefunken Trautonium. We had a Hammond Nova chord. We had the first few Moogs that had been done, and as a matter of fact, the first Model D, which is the popular mini Moog that people relate to the mini Moog, there were 3 models, A, B, C, and D, was still in our possession down in Florida, and the roof started caving in on the place where they were being stored, and Doug Truby, Les's youngest son, called me, and I said, well, I don't know what else to do. David Keene, who had done this huge collection out in California, and eventually it found its way to Canada, in a kind of a strange arabesque. But at any rate, a lot of those instruments are still there, so part of that dream sort of came true. But very difficult when you're way out in front of other people to get money, to convince them. I was invited as a speaker at the Smithsonian. Milton Babbitt was another speaker. There were very prestigious people there. And I felt, fortunate to just be on the lectern. And when I came to my speech, I told them that basically anything that's under 100 years of dust, leave it there. It won't lose much. But what you're losing right now is the living evolution of a new thing that's the big thing of the 20th century, electronic music. And I think I convinced them, but what good did that do? They said, well, we don't have any budget for doing something like that. They actually had the RCA synthesizer in storage for years and years. I'm not sure it ever saw the light of day. They really just didn't truly understand that while Archie Bunker's chair from the TV show might be of interest to a broad public, which they did have, that maybe it would have been nice to at least have had a part from the Telharmonium. And Thaddeus Cahill, that's 1896 instrument in this country. Which brother? I can't remember. Thaddeus Cahill was the progenitor. He was the architect, the designer. And his siblings were in business with him to make this music that would go out to dentists' offices and restaurants over telephone wires, of all things. This in 1906, 1907 eventually. Around 1930, I think, one of Cahill's brothers, tried to get anybody to at least just preserve a part of it. And I'm sure he approached the Smithsonian. No. So now we don't have even a tone wheel to marvel at from a 200-ton electrical musical instrument. I think we're simply poorer for that. But when people ask me, well, what are you professionally? Well, I'm a pedagogue, an author, and so forth, and have been a demonstrator and all the whole Moog experience. I said, but I'm really a futurist. A futurist is somebody that realizes in future what's happening right now will be interesting historically. So I don't think of myself as a historian at all. I think of myself as a futurist, and there's a lot of wild-eyed futurists that are just full of crap. Some people thought we'd all be flying helicopters to work. Well, that was nonsense to begin with. Or that there would be diesel airplanes. You look at the pages of 1930s popular science, popular mechanics, to see all kinds of visions. And the 1939 World's Fair in the United States was absurd in its view of the future, But some futures are easier to see than others. I mean, anybody that didn't understand that electronic music and these instruments were going to become important, it's hard for me to understand that they didn't understand. John Cage understood it, certainly, when he made his manifesto around 1930 about percussion and noise and, that kind of stuff. Sometimes wonder what Cage would have done if he had gotten a wonderful sampler, prepared piano, never mind. I mean, it's hard to imagine, what he would have done with that. But I knew him a little bit too and talked to him, and he told me he was so busy being John Cage, nobody would let him be anything else. Anywhere he went, he had to be John Cage of their recollection. It's like rock bands that go out, they have to play their hits. The public they don't want to hear the new stuff. They really want to hear, what they made love to, or, some connection there, some extra musical connection. So, yeah, history is a difficult idea to wrap your mind around. And for me, futurism is much more powerful than being a historian. I'm not interested in digging up the past, except to show people, look, in future, all the details of this will be of interest to people, and we're losing them. And indeed we have. We've lost many of those details. We have more of a consciousness for history now than at any time in my history. But, I know in spades, how many artifacts. When I talk to Pierre Schaeffer, where's the phonogen? Where's the morphophone from the early music concrete? Oh, I don't know, no telling. When I talk to Gottfried Michael Koenig in Utrecht, Holland, at the Sonologie, where are those loop machines and, the things? Oh, I think they were cannibalized or maybe thrown into the canal. Or no, that was Mueller at Cologne Studio that told me, I asked about some of that equipment in the early days, the early 50s, at the Northwest NWDR, Northwest Deutsche Rundfunk, the radio station in Cologne. So, and even people like Bob Moe, I practically begged him to videotape interview him. I don't know, we were friends. I could just never get him to do that. Very difficult. People have.
Yeah. Well, finally, he did accept having that
the Moog film.
Yeah. Did you?
I saw it.
Yeah.
I saw it and I didn't see it. I didn't look at it. The reason I didn't is this is somewhat painful. Bob died of a brain tumor. I'm not a doctor, but I really feel like he was having advance warning of that at the time he made that film. I never heard Bob wax so poetical and metaphysical about touching instruments and feeling what they were doing. That really just was not like Bob. And it bothered me when I saw that part of the film. And also I was aware, and I talked to Hans about that at Bob's memorial. I tried to interest him in a more general approach to a documentary about electronic instruments and electroacoustic music. And he told me, he says, no, I'm only interested in subcults. That's why I had this interest in Bob Moog. And that's okay. It's fine for a filmmaker to decide what he or she wants to do. I applaud. That's not my interest. The subcult. And what bothered me about the film, I think, was it truly was a subcult. It was kind of techno oriented. I mean, you really didn't get the sense that there were different cohorts. There was an avant-garde group. There was a fusion group with Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and there was certainly a progressive rock group, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Jan Hammer, and people like that were really, to my way of thinking, much more serious musical explorations of the Moog synthesizer than a lot of the techno that got on the Moog film. That was kind of it's what we've heard lately. There was, again, may I say it, the history, the realization that, there have been some really interesting musical thrusts with the Moog synthesizer, that it didn't just come out with these kind of plinky kinds of tunes and stuff like that. And I would ask Bob when I first interviewed him, I asked him about this or that. And sometimes he would only say something like, well, that's what some people can do with it. And you could tell that he didn't particularly, his musical taste ran towards more depth. Bob was a fair musician, actually, and had great ears from tuning oscillators all those years. He and I and a man named Tom Lamb did a number of performances at the Strassenberg Planetarium in Rochester, New York, of planetarium music. What else would you call it if you know about that era? And you know what planetarium music is, And Bob certainly held his own quite well and had a good ear, a good sensibility about music. He appreciated music of all stripes. And you could tell that sometimes it was like, well, it's not what I would have done with a Moog synthesizer. As a matter of fact, there's a virtual version that I felt like had not been handled very well. And I called Bob and I said, how did that lineage go, Bob? And I mean, did they call you and have you do that? Or, oh, no. They pretty much had done it and called me and, to get my blessing and imprimatur to use and so forth. And I said, wow, that's really what I thought. He says, well, it's not what I would have done. And that's Bob's way of saying a lot. I mean, you don't need any more from Bob Moog than that. It's not what I would have done. And I knew in a thrice, right. When I looked at it, I saw so many errors that I thought Bob wouldn't have done that.
What do you think about the revival of the Moog Company?
I think it's good. I mean, it was done under Bob's aegis to begin with. I love the idea that they made a thing that had basically an analog front end where all the sound was done with digital control. I'd felt for many years that would be a very viable and potent thing. I had even dreamed, and maybe I don't know enough technically to dreamed a reasonable dream. I had dreamed of a vacuum tube Moog synthesizer that was truly warm because I'd played the Hammond Nova chord, 168 vacuum tubes. Oh, richness beyond belief. All the filters were vacuum tubes. All the envelope generators were vacuum tubes. All the oscillators were vacuum tubes, 168 vacuum tubes. And as Bob said, yeah, it made as good a heater as it did a musical instrument. But, now we have vacuum tubes that are about this big. And there's a revival, of course, and this may come and go. This comment may not be for the ages, But there's a revival right now in 2008 of vacuum tube technology of all kind in audio, especially hi-fi kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of people making, again, because of the characteristic curve, vacuum tubes don't distort the same way transistors do, which Russ Ham knew, and musicians had been telling engineers, interesting aside, about guitar amps for years. That doesn't sound right. Well, it's the exact same circuit in transistors as it was in tubes. Well, Russ Ham had to stand up at AES one time, and it's in a paper. Yeah, it turns out that they distort with different kinds of harmonics, vacuum tubes and transistors. And vacuum tubes are more pleasing to the musician's ear. I have great faith in the artist and in the sensibility of the artist. When the rubber hits the road, we have subjective and an objective world. We have both worlds. I try to know something about both. The technical world, the measurement world, the objective world, what you can do with all of that is important, in my opinion, if you wish to progress in your understanding, especially of equipment and so forth, and be a teacher, certainly. The subjective world is fuzzy. It's hard to get a hold of. It's nasty. It's wet. It's moist. It's dirty, and yet, in the final analysis, it's the important world. Oh, you only perceive it that way. Well, if I only perceive it that way, that's the most important thing about the entire paradigm. How we hear, how we listen, what we like, what moves us, that kind of thing. And certainly, to that extent, I'm an heir of Bob Moog, within the field. A romantic, if you will. Yeah, I think Bob was a romantic. But when I saw that film, it set my teeth on edge. And I knew that the film was not universal in its approach about all the different kinds of music that were made with analog voltage controlled and that kind of stuff. That it was sort of cultish a little bit. So I've never even seen it from beginning to end. And I'm not disparaging the film. I know it's done well. It's quite good to have it.
And did Bob ask you at all about what he was doing when he was starting the business up again?
Oh, no, only superficially. I mean, by that time, I'd see him when he came to Berkeley, and we'd fall on each other and, embrace and so forth, and still good friends. But Bob could be quite hermetic and sort of unaware even. He had done certain things that ex post facto I figured out were pretty important historically and hadn't bothered to tell me. He knew what my interests were, but in his mind, he just didn't have that perspective. The things I fished out of his trash can, literally, at his home in Asheville, North Carolina. I mean, we're like, the first brochure that was ever done for a Moog module, and there with a date, a postmark right on the thing, and I'm thinking, good Lord, he's throwing this away. And for him, it was just like, and you can't expect the person doing the developing and all like that to also have the historical perspective. I don't think you can expect that very well. It's just two different heads. He was about doing all this stuff, and yeah, I've done things, but also I'm about looking and saying, that's important. People in the future are going to want to know about that. So I've saved a number of artifacts and stuff like that. And I'm happy that there's a place in Canada, I wish it had been the US, where people could go and look at a lot of those instruments. Bob pointed out to me, when we were doing the Electronic Arts Foundation, okay, when you get these instruments, so what? I said, well, we'll have them. He says, not long. Why not? He says, you can't keep them up. They're from all different eras of technology. And of course, he was right. Yeah. And then David Keene and I were talking about it. I told David that. I said, no, you got to record this stuff right away. That's the only thing we're going to be able to keep, the recordings. I don't think it's happened. It hasn't happened. And I'm sort of sad about that, because sometimes you only get one chance, to keep a weird instrument going and get the damn thing on a digital audio file. And then at least people know what it sounded like. Because who wants to read a book and hear talk about what something sounds like? I don't.
Mm. So what the Nova chord you really liked, did you? You really liked?
Yeah. Yeah, I love the Nova chord. It found its way into many movie scores, pop music, all the way up into the 60s for something that came about in when? 39, basically, with the Solovox and the versions of that, the JK&L series of the Solovox. And then the Nova chord was kind of like the big brother, polyphonic, with top octave synthesizer and dividers and so forth. And so rich, 6 modulating oscillators. Everybody wants to build the first synthesizer, and I don't want to call the Nova chord the first synthesizer, but it really had a lot of synthesizer-like things. It had an envelope where when you release the keys, it would still have a decay or a release. It had controllable attack. It had filters. It had modulating oscillators, 6 of them, 1 for every dyad, half step. Because you don't play many dyads in pop music, half steps. It's too dissonant. So as you were playing your 7th chords and everything, each oscillator would be vibrating, chorusing slightly differently from another, which Dave Luce affected on the Polymoog in a different way. But, there are just certain things about sound and music that I don't think are just going to go away, no matter what we talk about modernity and all this. They just don't go away. They seem to be basic kinds of information and ideas that, like it or not, we can't get away. People used to think, oh my God, infinite timbral space. Well, as it turns out, no. It's actually a very finite timbral space. Timbre is what our ears distinguish least well, and so forth. Okay, so there's actually a finite timbral space, and the bottom line is sort of like statistics. Something that can be statistically significant but meaningless. So once you have this kind of a clang sound or a bell, if you have something that's 2% different, who cares? So our actual and I got some of these ideas, I guess, from Wayne Slauson, in a wonderful book. I don't know, can't remember. I got so many books. But that idea was what drove people in the early part of electroacoustic. Well, I got all this timbre, Turns out it's just really not that interesting. Debussy sort of did Impressionism partly based on that idea of timbral kinds of things and everything. Very short period of music history, Impressionism. So dodecaphonic music, 12-tone music, serial music. If you don't have harmony and sometimes you don't have rhythm, what have you got? Well, you've got spectrum, you've got timbre. And again, very short period in music history. Of course, we still have people composing in 12-tone, but not like they thought. Very short period of music history. Sonata Allegro, very long period of music history. Very fertile form to be working in, kind of thing. So I've gone from being a progressive or even a radical, maybe to being a reactionary, which I think somebody needs to sound that note and be that voice. Yes, it could be me.
So are there any synthesizers that rival traditional instruments?
You mean virtual instruments that rival hardware?
No, I mean synthesizers that rival
piano and stuff like that. Oh, well, all of them in reality rival them because this is what gets recorded. Nothing can rival for me the sound of a Börsendorfer, 18-foot grand piano. I mean, these outrageous with the extra keys down at the bottom, and it's wonderful, wonderful sound. That's not what gets recorded. That's not what gets played at rock and roll concerts. Again, you got that idea about artistry, technology, and industry. And the Börsendorfer may be the most artistic, but it doesn't have much to do with industry out here and public acceptance and stuff like that. So in a sense, they already rival. Artistically, do they rival? Not many. Not many instruments, and one of the reasons is electronic instruments don't have their own literature. With the exception of the Martineau and a few theremin pieces and a scattering of Trautonian pieces, the Martineau, which was taught at the Paris Conservatory, probably has 400 or 500 works. That many, yeah. Not just the Jolivet and the things that everybody knows. Hundreds and hundreds of works. And it has a certain sensitivity because the pitch selecting agency, this hand, and the articulation agency, this hand, are independent. A piano, even, a wonderful instrument, but the pitch selection agency and the articulation agency are the same thing. Now, Dave Luce taught me to think in terms of degrees of freedom. Other people taught me how to think about aesthetic considerations. But you need to be able to, at a certain point, think about degrees of freedom. Why is it that you can listen to a string quartet all evening? And I find a pipe organ concert rather tedious after about an hour, no matter how good the music is. Why is that? Well, there are 9 degrees of freedom with the bow arm alone on a violin. I'm not talking aesthetics now, am I? No. Down and up on the pipe organ, and the slats that go back and forth for the wind chest. For the choirs of pipes, and some other things. There's a Gogic accent, how you wait on a note and stuff like that. But there's no touch sensitivity, and and yet it has its own literature that's sufficient to its degrees of freedom. But if you come to personal ideas, instruments that have more degrees of freedom usually are more expressive in the common sense of that word, and they generally have a bigger literature. Not always. The organ has a quite large literature. But I would never compare the organ to the violin in a sense of aesthetics. I would simply say, well, you got more degrees of freedom. And I think it does correlate with the ability to listen to that thing for a long, long time. So we're getting some better instruments now. The new electronic valve instrument, Niall Steiner's Outcome, the synthophone from Martin Herney, Switzerland. A lot of wind instruments, and I think wind instruments are going to play a more important role in the future. Why? Well, as soon as they get unshackled from MIDI, which could happen, you have to really force that continuous control into MIDI. And it screams and kicks when you do it. You can talk to Martin Herney about that, about what he had, the data streams he had to thin coming off the synthophone to work with MIDI. Most instruments don't have a note on, note off mentality. They creep out of nowhere, like a clarinet sotto voce. Mm-hmm. The model is not good for all instruments. And I'm fond of saying it should be called kitty or pity. Keyboard instrument digital interface or percussion instrument digital interface, not musical instrument digital interface. Too broad. This will change too. I think there are enough people around now that, truly understand, well, that wasn't a really good it was a good model for keyboards. That's what we were doing. I wanted to make this keyboard play that thing over there. Theater organ did that. This keyboard will play that xylophone over there. It was actually a very old model. I tried to prevail upon the people in the industry. I was in the business at that time to slow down, take a look at what we were doing, and not be pushed by the MIDI users of group, MUG, they were amateurs. They were just enthralled that anything could happen. So they were pushing it like mad. If you didn't get on board, you were going to be left behind as a manufacturer, which I recognize that for the industry part. For the aesthetic part over here, I knew this is not a very good model. MIDI sequencers, very useful, right? They are. But again, musicians are people that can do these circus acts in real time. That's why they're useful. We've done extraordinary things to make a bad model work pretty well. What's wrong with MIDI sequencers? Well, it goes back to what Max Matthews did with Music In. It's the same model. I have something called notes, which are just sort of abstract. They're notes. And now I can sprinkle textures on notes. What a dreadful idea. I mean, Rimsky-Korsakov and Kent Kennan and all the other people that did orchestration books are rolling in their graves. You can't just sprinkle textures on notes of any description. If you can, it becomes hilarity, it becomes funny, not particularly artistic. So just that model alone, when you think about it, is like, this is not a very good model. The ranges you play in and the notes you play and the way you articulate and all those things have a lot to do with the texture, the timbre of what it is you're playing. You know, this appears to be an instrumental viewpoint. I don't think so. I think it's a general viewpoint about sound and music. People say, well, Tom Ray, he just wants everybody to be an instrumentalist. No. I want them to be aware that every time you pick up a medium of any sort, it imprints on you, not the other way around. People will say, it's only a tool. Say, wait a minute, don't denigrate tools. There are things that will wear holes in your body. When you garden, you know, they will put blisters here. Tools, they will manipulate you, not the other way around. Give you an example. RCA synthesizer, 1955. 2 broad paper tapes like this. Milton Babbitt, a wonderful man, a great composer in my opinion, is doing these pointillistic pieces, very much in the dodecaphonic tradition, a lot of pointillism, in that tradition. For one thing, you needed to get through the row to the next note. Long sustained notes in drones, they don't sort of fit. Do you see what I'm saying about the medium itself? Now, the RCA got these 2 paper tapes. It turns out that one of the interesting details is to make a long note. You had these feelers underneath, and you had to punch down the paper tape in time. You couldn't, like on a modern MIDI synthesizer, say, oh, I want that note to last 2 minutes. Okay, so what would happen to your paper tape if you did a lot of that? It would turn into confetti. It would become dimensionally unstable. So when you listen to that entire school, with the exception of Charlie Warren, did some pieces where he used the buchla as well. He won a Pulitzer on one of them, times in encomium. If you listen to a lot of the output of that studio, the Columbia Princeton, it's nothing drone-like, nothing long and sustained, very little. And I maintain nothing, more earth-shaking than the fact that the medium you're working with would have become unwieldy, difficult to deal with, had you done certain things. So the same thing with MIDI. MIDI fits the pop thing with measures and notes and stuff like that. And people that know so little about orchestration, they can sprinkle textures on notes and see how it sounds to them and then decide. And often they don't have the ear to make that judgment either. It's something I point out to my students. It takes a long time to get a feel. Chris Noyes, one of my colleagues, Jeff Baust, they've been around. They can take stuff right off the shelf from 2 or 3 different places and put it together and know instantly whether it will work. Novices can't do that. They need this more didactic approach where I know what harmonics there are in this sound and what harmonics there are in this sound. Do they work? Yeah, do they work with each other? Is this a wild-eyed idea? No. Look at the woodwind choir and the symphony orchestra. Clarinet, a cylinder that makes odd harmonics only, mostly. Okay. Oboe, a truncated cone, makes all harmonics. Different formant structure in the oboe and bassoon. One's at about 1K, the other's at about 500. The clarinet's making odd. The flute is a very simple waveform, and it's voiced up here an octave above these other. I mean, if those instruments didn't evolve because of the ears of orchestrators and musicians based on their relative spectral content, then I'll eat one of those scores. They did do that. Therefore, that thing that works, why does it work? In other words, not just any combination of textures works. Not because it has to sound like an orchestra, because of the nature of our ears and the attention and where we have a basilar membrane and what can get stimulated and the auditory nerve and how it goes down to the brain. It's digital, by the way, our hearing, but how that works. Our hearing is digital. Yeah. If something gets louder on the tympanic membrane, you don't get a bigger signal down the auditory nerve. You get more pulses. Very interesting. It's digital. So, I don't know. To me, that's just an interesting aside when I discovered that. It's like, oh, it's like pulse code modulation. The pulses don't get bigger. They're just in a different configuration kind of thing. So, things that seem completely arbitrary in MIDI, particularly, you can do any damn thing you want to. You can juxtapose things as you wish, and you have this marvelous world where you can just do these arbitrary things. And I'm saying, yeah, but there's a limited subset that work.